Welcome to this chess video. This is perhaps my favorite variation in chess, so I'm pretty excited to share this secret with all of you. Now the secret is of course that most players in this position will be playing knight f3 because that's a very common variation to play in the Queen's Gambit, but I actually prefer to instead play this knight from g to e2. And in this video, I'll explain basically why you should be playing this and in what situations you should be. Now first I'll show how we get to this position, that way you know what I'm talking about, and then I'll actually show a little bit of history with some very strong chess players, and how Botvinnik actually came up with this entire system. Of course, most players know the Queen's Gambit. We'll start like this, plays the Queen's Gambit Declined, we'll play the exchange variation, and then the very common bishop g5. Very popular. I'm sure for the players who play this, they'll see bishop e7 most often. And if they don't, they'll probably see pawn to c6. And it doesn't really matter the move order because it'll definitely transpose. They'll castle, then they'll play this c6 at some point. And you just go with this exact same setup here. And now this is the exact position that we had earlier in the video, where now I prefer knight g to e2, but we'll now have to explain why, because objectively speaking, this is roughly about the same as knight f3. Now let's go to the groundbreaking moment in history where Botvinnik actually invented this system, and then we'll look at an improvement game of his real briefly, and then come back to this position and kind of finish up all of the thoughts on this variation. And I'm not going to go over those entire master games, but we'll just look at the opening and you'll see where he's coming from with this really cool idea. So here we have two very strong players, Botvinnik playing white and Karez playing black. This famous game was Moscow 1952, and as promised we'll go real quickly through the opening. Now the move order doesn't really matter too much. You'll notice this is the exact same thing that we got earlier. Of course I wouldn't be having a whole different variation. And now we have knight g to e2. And so you ask yourself, aha, why not knight f3? Well, in this exact case they have not yet played pawn c6. They're about to, not on this move, but on the very next move after. But of course, white will very often be playing for this minority attack in the Queen's Gambit Declined. Most people are familiar with that, where after they get castled safely, they'll have completed their piece development and then have to decide where to put their rooks. And many players will want to put this a rook here on b1, and then start advancing this pawn. The idea being that if this pawn is on c6, if they can advance their b pawn all the way up to b5, supported by the rook from behind, then they can hopefully trade off this pawn. And that'll make c6 actually a weakness, because here it'd be a backwards pawn because of the pressure from our d4 pawn. Now I'll go back a little bit and you'll see why they didn't go for this in this situation. If black does end up with a backwards pawn on c6, the most natural way to attack that is actually knight f3, and then this knight coming into e5 long term, and then actually attacking the c6 pawn. However, if white's idea is not the minority attack, the knight g to e7 might have some better ideas. In this case, black has not played pawn c6 yet, and so although knight f3 is okay here, Botvinnik actually had a different idea in mind. So after this, we have knight to f8, very common Queen's Gambit Decline move, where this knight is usually going to go to g6, or it'll simply stay here guarding extra support on the h7 pawn, which of course we have this really strong battery attacking. So the castle, pawn c6, and of course now you can't play knight f3 because you've already committed it to g2. So back in this game in 1952, Botvinnik went rook a to b1, which was of course a very standard idea at the time. Now keep this in mind, and kind of in the back of your head, this moment in history, because the knight might be a little bit misplaced here, preferring to be on f3 so it can go in for this minority attack idea, attacking the pawn. The game went bishop to d6, king h1, a prophylactic idea where he's intending to play the pawn up to f3, and then the pawn to e4, supporting the center even further, and in doing so, he just doesn't want his king on this diagonal that would be weaker as the pawns advance. So king h1 was just a little bit of extra safety. Knight g6, a very common idea, and now pawn to f3. Computer just calls this best. I might even manually change this to a great move, because historically speaking, this was the start of this entire idea of knight g to e2 and this f3 setup. And so the idea, as I'll show a little bit more in depth later, is to actually bring this bishop back and then harmoniously come back to f2 so we can help support these pawns in the center, and especially the d4 pawn against pawn c5. But I don't want to confuse people here and get ahead too quickly. So before we move on to the next game, I'd like to show one other thing real briefly, which is that in the real game after this, Botvinnik then played rook b to d1. And you'll notice that it cost him one move to put the a rook on b1, and then another move to put it on d1. So also kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And so once again, we have the patriarch, Botvinnik. But this game is over a decade later in 1965, and we'll see that he's now made an improvement over his previous system. The move order will transpose into a Queen's Gambit Declined, just like we had. Again, I'll go through the moves kind of quickly, because how we get here isn't too important. The main idea are the ideas after we get to the position, which is this position here. He does go Knight G to E2, which should kind of signal in the back of your mind he's not going for the minority attack. If he had wanted that, he would play the knight to F3 instead. But Knight G E2 means that he is not going for the traditional minority attack that was very common at the time. So we have pawn H6, bishop back to H4, and then after a normal developing move like rook E8, which was what happened in the game, now we have the really nice idea of pawn F3, the improvement. Because now he's going for the desired setup immediately, trying to bring this bishop back, not wasting a move putting the rook on B1, but in one move might be able to put the rook on D1 or E1 supporting one of the central pawns. In the real game it went pawn C5, white just simply castled, and then black played pawn A6. Of course trying to gain a lot of queenside space after pawn B5, and especially if they can get pawn C4, notice the power of black actually having the majority here. They'll have 3 pawns on this flank, and white will only have 2 pawns here, which of course gives black long-term potential to help create a pass pawn. But Botvinnik is not worried about that at this stage of the game. He simply plays rook A to D1, saving himself a move by not having to go to B1, and now he's adding some valuable support to the D pawn. Now in the actual game, black played pawn to B5, gaining their space as anticipated, and Botvinnik had a chance to actually play D captures C5, and play with a very slight positional advantage. But Botvinnik was known for having a fondness for closed positions, and so rather than taking there immediately, he instead chose to bring back the bishop, which I think is a very deep move. And to just say it's a mistake because you're stockfish seems to really kind of underscore the strong long-term potential of this bishop. Just imagine when this pawn actually advances, and then maybe even strikes in the center this way, or this pawn might even go to E5, support from the D4. You can tell how this bishop is going to be really good on this diagonal, not only helping shield their king, but also help fight against this pawn C5 move. And one last thing is also notice Botvinnik has saved another move because they have not needed to move their king to H1 like before. Now the bishop on this diagonal just simply does all of the protecting it needs. Now let's return back to our original position and kind of review the idea that I mentioned, but a little bit more in depth. So Knight G E2 is the main idea that I'm advocating for here, and what I actually play myself. And if they play a move like pawn H6, we'll just simply bring the bishop back to H4. If they continue developing their pieces, then we play pawn F3, going for our desired setup. And just to illustrate a concept, although it's not objectively best, let's say they move knight, trying to provoke us to actually trade here on E7. We can keep pieces on the board, especially valuable if you're the higher rated player against your opponent. Instead of trading, what we go is bishop to F2, and we have our ideal setup, where this pawn on F3 is helping support pawn E4 and really grab aggressive control of the center. And in doing so, this bishop helps protect the D4 pawn and add even more support fighting against one of black's main pawn breaks, pawn to C5, trying to fight for the center. Now returning back to the critical juncture here, knight F3 is also perfectly playable and a book move, and you're more than welcome to play that as well. But of course with this, we're no longer going for F3 and E4. It doesn't make sense because now the knight is blocking that pawn. And so if you choose to play the knight F3 idea, now the minority attack becomes something you might want to do, where at some point this rook might go to B1, probably after white castles, and then this pawn can start advancing, hopefully trade itself off for the C pawn, giving black a backwards pawn on C6, that's a weakness, and long term this knight on F3 might have more pressure coming into C6. Now I repeat these ideas intentionally, because now I've introduced you to the idea, and further I'm now reinforcing it by repeating this concept. This is one of my favorite variations to play, this knight G to E2, rather than knight F3. Although I've played both, knight G to E2 is just a little bit less common, so it's got a little bit more surprise value, but it's also really objectively strong. So the choice of which opening variation to choose is of course yours, but if you're a fan of Botvinnik and would like to play games like what I play, then definitely check out this knight G to E2 variation in the Queen's Gambit Declined. Thanks for stopping by, I'll see you in the next chess video.